The wind came down out of the bitterroots that November like something with a grudge. And Hollis Wren was still 3 miles from her own gate when she saw the boy sitting in the middle of the wagon road. He was not sitting the way a child sits when he is playing. He was sitting the way a small animal sits when it has decided it cannot go any farther. His knees were up around his ears, and his hands were tucked so far inside the sleeves of a man's coat that the sleeves looked empty. Behind him, on a peeled aspen staff, stood a drifter so thin he seemed to have been folded twice and put away wet. Hollis reined the mare in. The mare did not want to stop. The mare wanted her stall, and her oats, and the lee side of the barn. "Mom," the drifter said. His voice was the voice of a man who had been swallowing dust for 100 miles. "I would not ask if I had anywhere else to ask." "Ask what?" "Just let my boy sleep by your stove tonight." He did not step closer. He knew better. "One night. I will sleep in your barn or your woodshed or your snow. I do not care. Just the boy. By the stove." Hollis looked at the boy. The boy did not look up. His eyelashes were white with frost, and the frost had not melted, which told her more than any doctor could. She had buried a husband in the spring and a brother in the summer, and she had 460 heads of half-whaled cattle strung out across a valley that the almanac men were already calling the coldest winter since '68. She had a mortgage note in her kitchen drawer that a man in Helena expected to be paid by the 1st of April. She had every reason in the world to say no. She said, "Put him up behind me." The drifter's face did something that was not quite crying. "There is a bunkhouse," she said before he could speak. "It has not been slept in since May. You will find split wood along the north wall. Do not touch the small door in the back. That is not a door. That is the reason my ranch is still standing." He did not ask what she meant. Drifters who have lasted long enough to ask for stove heat for their children have learned not to ask. His name, she found out over cornbread and beans, was Elias Cobb. The boy was Toma, which she guessed was short for something longer that had been left behind in a language she did not speak. Elias had been a millwright in Wisconsin until the mill burned. He had been a teamster in Dakota until the team froze. He had been walking since August, following work that kept moving one town ahead of him, and now he was here in the Bitterroot Valley in the last week, before the passes closed, with a 7-year-old boy and a coat that had been good in 1878. Hollis fed them. She did not talk while they ate. Talking while a hungry man eats is a cruelty because it slows him down. When Toma finally set down his spoon, he was asleep before the spoon touched the table. Elias carried him to the pallet by the stove and did not let go of him for a long time. "Mom," he said finally, "why would you do this?" "Because I have been cold," Hollis said. That was all she said. She went out to check the barn. The barn was where the strangeness of Hollis Wren's ranch began, though a man passing on the road would not have seen it. From the outside, the barn looked like any other Montana barn. Cottonwood, boards silvered by weather, a shake roof, a wide double door on iron strap hinges. It was what was inside the walls that a stranger could not see. Her father had built the place in '69, and her father had been a queer, quiet Welshman who had spent one winter as a boy in a shepherd's hut in the mountains of Powys, and had come out of that winter believing certain things about walls. Hollis had been the only child left to listen, and she had listened, and she had never forgotten. The walls of the barn were double. 2 full walls set 18 inches apart, tied together with cross pins of green oak that had been driven wet, and had swelled tight as they dried. The gap between the walls was not empty. Every autumn, when the meadow hay came in, her father had taken the second cutting, the fine leafy kind that cattle liked best, and stuffed it, forkful by forkful, tamped down with a wooden maul, into the cavity between the inner and outer wall. Hay, just hay. From the floor of the barn to the eave line, all the way around on every side, tamped so tight a knife would not go through it. The neighbors, when they had noticed at all, had thought it was a waste of hay. Her father had smiled and said nothing. Her father had smiled at most things and said nothing. The house was built the same way. So was the spring house. So was the little smokehouse behind the kitchen. 4 buildings on the Wren place, and every one of them was really 2 buildings, one inside the other, with a thick, quiet coat of dry meadow grass sleeping between them. Hollis walked the barn now with her lantern low. She listened. A well-packed wall will tell you when something is wrong. A well-packed wall does not creak in the wind because the wind cannot find it. A well-packed wall does not drip because the warm inside air cannot reach the cold outside boards to give up its moisture. A well-packed wall is silent, and the silence is the sound of a thing working. The barn was silent. Good. She went to the small door in the back that she had told Elias not to touch. It was set low, waist high, and it opened not into the barn but into the wall itself, into the cavity, into the hay. Once a month, all winter, she opened that door and pushed her arm in up to the shoulder and felt. If the hay was dry, all was well. If the hay was damp, something was leaking somewhere, and she had until the next storm to find it. The hay tonight was dry as August. She closed the door and latched it, and she stood in the dark barn for a moment with her hand on the inner wall, the way another woman might stand with her hand on the shoulder of a sleeping child. Then she went back to the house to sleep, and she left the drifter and his boy by her stove, which was a thing she would not have done a year ago, when there had still been men on the place. In the morning Toma was standing at the kitchen window, watching a magpie. He was still wearing the man's coat. He had slept in it. Hollis put a plate of biscuits and gravy in front of him, and he ate the way a wolf pup eats, one eye on her the whole time, not from fear but from the animal's certainty that the food might be taken back. Elias came in from the bunkhouse with snow on his shoulders. He had already, she saw, split the pile of green fir she had been meaning to split for a week. He had stacked it against the woodshed in the way a millwright stacks wood, which is the correct way, with the bark side up so the rain runs off. "Mr. Cobb," she said, "Mom, I have 460 head of cattle out in that valley. I have one hired hand named Peter who is 62 years old and has one good hand. I have a note due in April that I do not know how I will pay. The passes will close in about 9 days by my reckoning. If you and the boy stay past those 9 days, you stay until May." He looked at her. "I am not offering charity," she said. "I am offering work. The work will not be easy. I cannot pay much. I can pay for food, a roof, and, if we come through, a share of the spring calves." Elias set down his hat. "Mom," he said, "I have not been offered work in 7 months. I have been offered pity, and I have been offered the road, and once in Bozeman I was offered a bullet. I have not been offered work. Then it is offered now." He looked at Toma. Toma had gravy on his chin and was watching them with the concentrated attention of a child who has learned early that grown-up conversations decide everything. "We stay," Elias said. The 9 days before the pass closed were the days Hollis Wren later remembered as the days she stopped being alone. She had not known she had been alone. That is the thing about being alone on a ranch after a burying. You do not notice it until it stops. Peter came down from the upper cabin on the second day, walking stiff-legged the way he did when the cold got into his hip. He looked Elias up and down without expression and said, "You know cattle, I know mules." Elias said, "I know oxen. I do not know cattle." "Cattle are stupider than mules and meaner than oxen," Peter said. "You will learn." That was from Peter a warm welcome. He turned to Toma. "Boy, can you carry a bucket?" Toma nodded. "2 buckets." Toma nodded again, very seriously. "Then you are hired," Peter said. And that was Toma hired. They spent the 9 days doing what Hollis called the closing up. It was the work her father had taught her, and that she had taught Peter, and that she now taught Elias. And it was the work that most ranches in the valley did not do, which was why most ranches in the valley lost 1/3 of their herd in a bad winter, and the Wren place did not. They cut a firebreak of bare earth around all 4 buildings, 30 feet out. They cleared the roof shakes of every leaf and needle. They went around the base of the barn and the house, and the spring house and the smokehouse, with a bucket of ash and a trowel, and they packed ash into every mouse hole and every crack where a chipmunk had thought about wintering. Ash, her father had said, is a thing small animals do not like, and small animals in your walls in November become dead animals in your walls in February, and dead animals in your walls become wet walls, and wet walls become cold walls, and cold walls kill cattle. They went up on the roofs. Elias, who had been a millwright, was good on a roof. They checked every shake, every ridge cap, every place where the stovepipe came through. Where the stovepipe came through the kitchen roof, Hollis showed him the tin collar and the little clay skirt around the collar, and she told him about the smokehouse fire of '74 that had killed her Uncle Reese. And Elias did not need to be told twice to be careful. On the 5th day they brought the cattle down. The Wren place had 2 pastures, the high summer pasture up in the timber, and the low winter pasture down along the creek. And the low winter pasture was not what most ranchers would have called a pasture at all. It was a bowl, a shallow south-facing bowl of ground, 3/4 of a mile long, with a low ridge on the north side and a stand of old cottonwoods on the west. Her father had bought the place over more valuable ground because of that bowl. Cold air, he had said, is a fluid. Cold air rolls downhill like water and pools in the low places. If you know that, you build your pasture where the cold air does not pool. You build it on a shoulder or on a bench or, best of all, in a bowl that opens south, where the cold air can drain out the low end and the winter sun can crawl in the open side. The neighbors whose cattle wintered in the flat bottoms along the river lost animals every February to what they called the killing damp. The Wren cattle, in their south-facing bowl behind their windbreak of cottonwoods, did not. That was one secret. It was not the main secret. The main secret was still in the walls. On the 9th day the snow came. It came the way big snow comes in that country, not as a storm but as an announcement. The sky went the color of a tin plate around noon. By 3 the first flakes were falling, and they were the wrong kind of flakes, the small hard ones that do not drift down at an angle, as if someone were throwing them. By dark the road up to the pass was gone. Elias stood on the porch and watched it come. "Mom," he said, "I would like to say something." "Say it." "I would like to say I am sorry I brought my boy to your door." "Why?" "Because I do not know if I can earn what you are giving him." Hollis was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Cobb, my father built 4 buildings on this ranch. He built them a certain way, and the way he built them is the reason I still have a ranch. He built them the way he did because when he was a boy in Wales, a shepherd took him into a stone hut in a storm and did not ask him to earn it. My father spent the rest of his life earning it. He built these walls to earn it. Do you understand me?" "I think I do." "Then earn it the same way, not by paying me back, by building the walls." He looked at her, and then he looked at the snow, and then he went inside to check on Toma, who was asleep by the stove with a barn cat on his chest. The first month of the winter was not a hard month. The first month was the teaching month. Hollis taught Elias the ranch the way her father had taught her, which was by not explaining anything until it was necessary. Elias noticed things. That was his gift, and Hollis saw it early. He noticed that the kitchen stove burned about half the wood the bunkhouse stove burned, though both stoves were the same make, and both rooms were about the same size. He noticed that the springhouse water never froze, though the creek outside froze 2 feet thick. He noticed that on the coldest mornings, when frost stood on the inside of the bunkhouse windows, there was no frost on the inside of the house windows, none at all. Though the house was not being heated any harder, he did not ask about any of it. He watched. On the 3rd week of December, at supper, he finally said, "Mom, what about them? They are packed with something." "Hay." He set down his fork. "Meadow hay," she said, "second cutting, tamped tight, 18 inches of it, all the way around every building on this place. My father did it in '69, and every fall since, whoever has been alive on the ranch has climbed up on those walls and topped off any place that has settled. This year that was me and Peter in September. Next year it will be you if you are still here." "Hey." Elias said, "Hey, that is why the kitchen only burns half the wood. That is why the kitchen only burns half the wood." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The bunkhouse. The bunkhouse is single-walled. My father ran out of time in '71, and then he ran out of years. I have been meaning to do it for 11 winters." "How much hay?" "About 4 ton for the bunkhouse. We have it. It is stacked in the hayloft under the tarp on the east side." Elias nodded slowly, and Hollis saw him doing the millwright's arithmetic behind his eyes, the arithmetic of joists and studs, and how you open a wall without letting the roof fall on your head. "After the new year," she said. "When the deep cold comes, that is when we will need the bunkhouse warm." "After the new year," he agreed. Toma, who had been eating quietly and listening the way children listen, which is more carefully than adults, said, "Is that why the barn does not have any icicles?" All 3 of them looked at him. "The neighbor's barn has icicles," Toma said. "The one down the road, it has big icicles all along the roof. Ours does not." Peter, who almost never smiled, smiled. "Boy," he said, "you are going to be useful." Icicles, Hollis explained, were a barn telling on itself. Icicles meant the roof was warm enough to melt the underside of the snow, which meant heat was leaking out of the barn, which meant the cattle inside were spending their body heat warming the sky instead of warming themselves. A barn with icicles was a barn losing weight off its cattle every day. A barn without icicles was a barn holding its heat. The Wren barn had no icicles. The neighbor's barn 3 miles down had icicles as long as a man's arm. Toma spent the rest of that supper looking very thoughtful, and Hollis understood, watching him, that a child who noticed icicles was a child who might, in 20 years, build walls like her father's. January came to mean. The thermometer on the porch which was a real mercury thermometer her father had brought from St. Louis, went to 20 below on the 2nd, and stayed there for 6 days. On the 5th day it went to 32 below at dawn. The mercury pulled down into the bulb and sat there like a small silver eye and refused to move. The cattle in the south-facing bowl stood in the sun, when there was sun, and lay down in the lee of the cottonwoods when there was not, and lost less weight than they should have. The Wren place had lost 2 calves so far, both of them born late and weak. Down at the Halloran place, 4 miles east, they had lost 11 heads in a single night when the cold came off the flat bottoms and pooled where the cattle were sleeping. Ed Halloran rode over on the 7th to borrow hay. Hollis gave him hay. She did not tell him about the walls. Her father had never told anyone about the walls either. It was not a secret. It was that no one who had not lived in one of the buildings would believe the difference, and men who do not believe a thing do not build it. On the 10th of January, Elias began the bunkhouse. He did it in sections the way Hollis's father had done the barn. He built a false inner wall of rough sawn pine 2x4s on 16-inch centers, sheathed with the cheapest boards they had, set 18 inches inside the existing wall. He tied the 2 walls together with green oak pegs that he cut himself in the shed at night while Toma held the lantern. Then, on a clear day when the wind was down, he and Petter and Hollis climbed up on ladders and began to pack. Packing a wall with hay is not the work people think it is. You do not stuff it in loose. You take a forkful, you shake it out so the stems all lie the same way, and you lay it in the cavity in a flat layer, and then you take the maul, a wooden maul, never iron because iron sparks and hay is hay, and you tamp it down until it will not compress any more. Then you do it again, and again. A wall 8 feet tall and 20 feet long takes a full day, 3 people, and about a ton of hay, and at the end of the day your arms do not belong to you. They did the north wall of the bunkhouse first, because the north wall is where the wind lives. They did the west wall second, because the west wall is where the storms come from. They did the east wall third. They left the south wall for last because the south wall gets the sun and needs the least help. Toma, who was 7, could not swing a maul. Toma carried hay. He carried hay up the ladder, forkful by small forkful, and he carried it without complaining. And by the 3rd day his hands were so raw that Hollis made him mittens out of an old flour sack lined with lamb's wool from the shearing crate. He wore them proudly. On the evening of the 4th day, when the last of the east wall was tamped and the boards were nailed back over the cavity, Elias sat down on an overturned bucket and did not get up for a long time. "Mom," he said, "Mr. Cobb, I have been thinking about my boy." "Yes," he asked me. "The first night here, why you took us in." I told him it was because you were a kind person. That was a lazy answer. I have been thinking about the real answer for 2 months. "And? You took us in because you had walls that could hold 2 more people. Not walls of hay, walls of—" He waved a hand at the ranch, at the barn, at the house, at the invisible design that ran through all of it. Of design, of thinking ahead. Somebody thought about us before we ever showed up. Not us in particular, but somebody who might come. "My father," Hollis said. "Your father built a ranch that could hold strangers." "Yes," Elias nodded. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who now knew how to tamp hay. "I would like to build like that," he said, "the rest of my life, if I get the rest of my life." Hollis did not answer. There was not, she thought. In answer to that, she poured him coffee. On the 18th of January the wind came. It was not a storm at first. It was a wind. It came out of the northwest at a speed that made the pine trees on the ridge bend the wrong way, and it did not stop. It blew all day on the 18th, and all night on the 18th, and all day on the 19th, and all night on the 19th. And by the morning of the 20th, every drift in the valley had been picked up and put down somewhere else, and the snow was so hard on top that a full-grown steer could walk on it without breaking through. That is when the second storm hit. Old-timers in the Bitterroot country still talk, or their grandchildren do, about the January of '86, when first came in 3 days, and the third one was the one that took the herds. The first storm dumped the snow. The second storm packed it. The third storm brought the killing cold, 44 below at Missoula, 48 at Deer Lodge, and a wind on top of it that pulled the heat out of an animal, like a hand pulling a glove inside out. The Wren cattle came through it because of the bowl. That is the part Hollis had built for. The bowl held them out of the worst of the wind, and the south face gave them what sun there was, and the cottonwoods on the west broke the gusts, and when the third storm hit on the 21st, the herd bunched in the lee of the ridge the way her father had known they would, and only 3 cows went down, and one of those was old, and would have gone down anyway. The buildings came through it because of the walls. That is the part her father had built for, and that is the part that, on the night of the 21st, Elias Cobb finally understood in his bones. He understood it because Toma got sick. It came on fast, the way it does in children. A cough in the afternoon, a hot forehead by supper. By midnight the boy was burning, his breath rattling, his small chest working like a bellows. Hollis had seen it before. She had seen it in her brother 40 years earlier, and her brother had lived, and she had seen it in a neighbor's child the previous winter. And the neighbor's child had not. The neighbor's child had died in a single-walled cabin at 30 below. The rule with lung fever her mother had taught her was warmth and moisture and steady air, not hot, steady. A room that changed temperature 4 times in a night killed a sick child. A room that stayed within 2 degrees of itself, hour after hour, gave the child's body a chance to do its own work. The bunkhouse, with its 3 new walls of tamped hay and its old south wall of single boards, was not steady enough. The house was. They moved Toma into the house. They put him on the pallet by the stove, the same pallet where he had slept the first night. Elias sat on the floor beside him. Hollis kept the stove at a low, steady burn. Not hot, steady the way her mother had taught her, feeding it small split pieces of dry fur every 40 minutes. And Peter brought in kettles of water from the spring house and set them on the stove to steam. And the steam softened the air, and the walls held the warmth, and the walls held the moisture too. Because a wall packed with dry hay is a wall that breathes slowly, letting a little moisture through, not letting it condense on the inside boards, not letting it freeze there and then thaw and then freeze again. The temperature in the kitchen that night, by the mercury thermometer on the shelf, moved between 61 and 63 degrees. Outside, the wind was pulling 44 below off the ridge. Inside, the walls held. The stove burned about 1/3 of the wood a single-walled cabin would have burned to hold the same heat, and the wood pile, which Elias had spent the fall splitting, held. Toma's fever broke at 4 in the morning. Hollis knew it broke because his breathing changed. It went from the small, hard rattling to something longer and slower, and then he opened his eyes and looked at his father and said, in a voice like a scrape of paper, "I am thirsty." Elias put his face in his hands. Hollis brought water. She brought it in a tin cup, and she held the cup while Toma drank, and when he had finished she set the cup down, and she stood for a moment with her hand on the wall of the kitchen, on the inside of the wall, on the boards that her father had nailed up in the summer of '69, over 18 inches of tamped meadow hay, in a country where no one else did such a thing. The wall was warm, not hot. Warm the way a horse's flank is warm when the horse has been standing quietly in the sun. The wall had been warm all night, and it would still be warm at dawn, and it had kept a sick child alive. Hollis Wren did not cry easily. She had not cried at her husband's grave, and she had not cried at her brother's. She cried a little then, quietly, with her hand on the wall, and no one saw her, because Elias had his face in his hands, and Peter was asleep in the chair by the door, and Toma had already gone back to sleep. The winter did not end in a day. Winters do not. February came in cold and stayed cold, and there were 2 more storms, and 1 week in the middle of the month when the mercury did not climb above 0 for 9 days running. The Halloran place lost 60 heads. The Peterson place on the flat by the river lost so many that Ole Peterson came over one afternoon and sat in Hollis's kitchen and cried without shame. And Hollis fed him and gave him a side of pork and did not tell him about the walls, because it was too late in the year for walls. She told him about the bowl, though. She walked him out to the low pasture in the afternoon and showed him how the ridge broke the wind, and how the cottonwoods broke it again, and how the ground opened to the south so the cold air ran off. She told him he could do it in 1 summer if he started in April. He listened. She thought he might do it. She hoped he would. By the 1st of April, when the note came due in Helena, the Wren herd had lost 11 head out of 460. 11. In a winter that took 1/3 of some ranches and half of others. Hollis rode into Helena with Peter and paid the note in cash, from the sale of 19 steers she had held back specifically for that purpose, and she came home with the receipt in her coat pocket, and a peppermint stick for Toma in the other pocket. Elias had, in her absence, begun the south wall of the bunkhouse. He had cut the pine himself. He had milled the boards on the small water-powered saw down at the creek, which he had repaired in March because he was a millwright, and repairing saws was what a millwright did when he was not tamping hay. He had the frame up by the time Hollis rode in, and Toma was carrying boards for him, and Peter was cutting green oak pegs on the shaving horse in the shed. Hollis reined the mare in and watched them for a while before they saw her. She thought about her father. She thought about a shepherd in Wales in 1840-something, taking in a boy who had nowhere to go, and she thought about the long chain of decisions that had run from that stone hut in Powys, through her father's hands to this ranch in Montana, and she thought about how the chain was not going to stop with her, because a millwright and his son were building the last wall of the bunkhouse and would, next fall, help her top off the barn, and the fall after that they would maybe start a fifth building, a small one, a one-room place a young family could live in, double-walled, hay-packed, quiet in the wind. Elias saw her and lifted his hat. She lifted hers back. Toma came running. He had grown 2 inches over the winter in his hands. When he reached up to take the peppermint stick were the hands of a boy who had learned to work. That is the story of the winter Elias Cobb, and his boy came to the Wren place. It is not a story about kindness, though kindness ran through it like a thread. It is a story about walls, about the 18 inches of tamped meadow hay that stood, silent and dry, between one Montana family and a January that killed cattle by the thousand. It is a story about a Welshman who spent one night in a shepherd's hut in Powys as a boy, and spent the rest of his life building huts that could take in other boys. It is a story about a bowl of ground that opened south, and cottonwoods that broke the wind, and a barn with no icicles, and a stove that burned half the wood, and a sick child whose fever broke at 4 a.m. because a wall was warm. Most of the ranches in that valley are gone now. Their foundations lie in the grass, and the grass grows tall over them in summer, and the snow lies deep on them in winter, and no one remembers whose they were. A few of the buildings still stand. If you drive the back road up out of the Bitterroot on a cold day in January, you can see them. You will know them by one thing: they are the ones with no icicles. If this story stays with you, walk the rest of the way with us, subscribe, and let the next forgotten skill find you before winter does.